Does the fiscal deficit matter during the economic slowdown? Let's discuss. The government has targeted to keep the fiscal deficit at 3.3% of India's GDP, which roughly translates into borrowings of almost 7.03 lakh crores for the financial year 2019-20. However, according to the latest report published by the Controller General of Accounts or CAG India, has already exceeded its fiscal deficit target during the first 7 months of the financial year. According to the latest reports, government fiscal deficits currently stand at 7.2 lakh crores. The 7.2 lakh crores than the 7.03 lakh crores. The increase in the fiscal deficit is understandable since the government is required to undertake higher expenditure so as to combat the present economic slowdown. At the same time, the decline in the tax revenue collection has also contributed to the increase in the fiscal deficit. In this regard, concerns have been raised that government may not be able to fulfill its commitment of keeping the fiscal deficit at 3.3% of the GDP. But the larger question which arises is, should we have to worry about the fiscal deficit during the economic slowdown? So that is the pertinent question to ask. Understanding the various deficits in India, the government is said to incur deficit if its expenditure is higher than the revenue. The government deficit is mainly measured in three ways. First one is revenue deficit. It is calculated as revenue expenditure minus revenue receipts. That is, it highlights the deficit in the revenue account. Fiscal deficit. It denotes the total borrowings of the government for the entire financial year. The borrowed money may be used for meeting revenue expenditure, maintenance related expenses, as well as capital expenditure, creation of new assets. And next thing is primary deficit. It is calculated as fiscal deficit minus interest payments. Relation between fiscal deficit and economic growth. The developing countries such as India usually generate less amount of tax revenue. However, they are required to undertake higher amount of expenditure for the social sector such as education, health, etc., as well as for creating new assets and infrastructure. Hence, they would be required to borrow money in order to meet their expenditure requirements. However, a higher amount of borrowing can increase the rate of inflation in the economy and can hence pose a adverse risk. Thus, there should be a limit on the government's borrowing so that it does not lead to inflation in future. At the same time, the borrowed money should be ideally used for creating new assets and infrastructure, that is capital expenditure, rather than meeting the day-to-day maintenance related expenditure, revenue expenditure. This is because the money spent on the capital expenditure has much higher returns unlike the maintenance related expenditure. For instance, higher investment in the development of ports and airports can have a number of benefits such as creation of employment opportunities, development of infrastructure, boosting of exports, etc., which in turn enhances the ability of the government to repay the borrowed money. Thus, the fiscal deficit is said to be desirable in a country like India if it fulfills two conditions. There must be a limit on the fiscal deficit so that higher fiscal deficit does not lead to increase in inflation. The fiscal deficit must ideally be used for financing the creation of assets. The present scenario in India. In order to ensure the fiscal discipline and to keep the fiscal deficit under check, the Parliament has formulated the Fiscal Responsibility and Budget Management Act 2003, FRBM Act 2003. Under this act, the government has been mandated to keep the fiscal deficit at 3% of GDP by the end of 31st March 2021. At the same time, the government has been given freedom to exceed the fiscal deficit target by 0.5% on account of certain factors. These factors are national security, war, collapse of agriculture, structural reforms, and decline in the GDP growth of a quarter by 3%. The government has committed itself to keeping the fiscal deficit under check by undertaking various expenditure rationalization measures. However, the government has been spending a higher share of its fiscal deficit for the revenue expenditure rather than the capital expenditure. This clearly shows that the government has failed to optimally utilize its borrowings for undertaking the expenditure for the creation of new assets. This has to be reversed by reducing the revenue deficit and by ensure that a higher share of fiscal deficit is used for capital expenditure. In order to counter the present economic slowdown, some of the economists have highlighted that government should not unduly be worried about the fiscal deficit. Government must focus on providing the fiscal stimulus measures by undertaking higher expenditure for the creation of new assets. Such high expenditure has the potential to create more employment opportunities and boost the declining demand in the Indian economy, leading to increase in the GDP growth in future.